of the Doge's Palace, or St. Mark's, or the Grand Canal. But surprisingly, 100 years or so before photography as we know it, he was using a camera obscura. And this is it. This is the original one. It's got a canal on the top, a very simple box with a lid that comes up, a lens in the front here that you can actually focus by pulling in and out. And the light enters into the box and is reflected by a looking glass at 45 degrees, exactly like a modern reflex camera.
He was the Queen's most trusted confidant. Then everything changed. One photograph, one midnight phone call, one secret so explosive it could end the royal family forever.
Take the tape off and leave it like that for maybe half a minute or 2 minutes. You have to experiment. And because a ray of light goes in a straight line, a ray of light from the top of the salute will go through the pinhole and make an image on the photographic paper at the bottom.
They tried to silence him. They failed. What he revealed in those final moments will leave you speechless. The palace is furious this got out. But before they scrub this from the internet, you need to know the truth. This changes everything we thought we knew. Anthony Armstrong Jones didn't start life as royalty, but nobody could deny that his family moved in exclusive circles. His father worked as a barrister, a respectable profession that placed them firmly in Britain's upper class. However, it was his mother's second marriage that really elevated their social standing. When she married Lawrence Parsons, the 6th Earl of Ross, young Anthony suddenly found himself connected to the nobility. In 1930s England, this kind of association opened doors that would have otherwise remained firmly closed. Like many boys from privileged backgrounds, Anthony was sent away to boarding school. He attended several institutions before eventually landing at Eton, one of the most prestigious schools in the country. It was during these formative years that he discovered several passions that would shape his future. Photography caught his interest early on, providing him with a creative outlet that set him apart from his more traditionally minded peers. He also took up boxing and rowing, displaying the kind of athletic determination that impressed his teachers and fellow students. This drive became even more remarkable considering he had to overcome a significant physical challenge. A childhood battle with polio had left him with a noticeable limp, but he refused to let this limitation define him or hold him back from the activities he enjoyed. After finishing at Eton, Anthony moved on to Cambridge University, where he enrolled to study architecture. For a while, everything seemed to be going according to plan. He was following a respectable path that would lead to a stable career, one that his family could approve of without hesitation. Architecture was seen as a suitable profession for someone of his background, blending creativity with practical application in a way that satisfied both artistic and conventional sensibilities. However, his time at Cambridge took an unexpected turn when he failed his second-year examinations. At first glance, this appeared to be nothing more than a temporary setback, the kind of academic stumble that many students experience and quickly recover from. In reality, this failure became a turning point that would redirect his entire life trajectory. The failure forced Anthony to reconsider his path forward. Rather than pushing through with architecture, he began to seriously contemplate a different career altogether. He wanted to become a professional photographer, turning the hobby he had discovered at Eton into his life's work. This decision did not sit well with his parents, who had always maintained a somewhat distant and cold relationship with their son. Their disapproval became even more pronounced when he announced his intention to pursue photography professionally. In their view, this was not a serious occupation for someone of his class and connections. Photography might be acceptable as a gentleman's hobby, but making it a career seemed beneath what they expected from him. Despite their objections, Anthony had influential connections thanks to his upbringing, his stepfamily's noble status, and the network he had built during his years at England's most elite educational institutions. These relationships would prove invaluable as he worked to establish himself in his chosen field. Throughout the 1950s, Anthony set about making a name for himself in the photography world. He focused primarily on fashion photography and theatrical portraits, two areas where his artistic eye and social connections gave him distinct advantages. His studio on Pimlico Road became increasingly well known, not just for the quality of work produced there, but also for the atmosphere Anthony cultivated. He had a reputation for throwing parties that attracted London's creative set, and these gatherings became the stuff of legend. Beautiful young women who came to pose for fashion shoots often found themselves invited to stay for these events. The studio became a place where the boundaries between professional and personal life blurred considerably, and gossip about what went on there spread throughout London's social circles. Beyond the stories about his parties and his way with female models, other rumors began to circulate about Anthony's personal life. He had numerous gay friends, which was notable in an era when homosexuality remained illegal in Britain. Whispers about possible relationships with men followed him throughout this period, though he never publicly addressed these rumors. Whether true or not, these stories added to his reputation as someone who lived outside conventional boundaries, a creative figure who refused to be constrained by traditional expectations about how people of his class should behave. As Anthony's photography career flourished, he began to set his sights on an even more prestigious target. He wanted to photograph the royal family. The timing worked in his favor. His growing reputation, combined with his social connections, meant that he was already moving in circles adjacent to royalty. When Queen Elizabeth II needed official portraits taken, Anthony found himself in the right place at the right moment. The Queen decided to give him the opportunity, and he was commissioned to take several photographs of her and various family members. His approach to royal photography differed significantly from what had come before. Previous royal photographers had maintained a very formal, traditional style that emphasized majesty and distance. Anthony brought a more relaxed and naturalistic approach to his royal portraits. This was controversial in some quarters, where people felt that royalty should be depicted in a more conventional, reverential manner. However, Queen Elizabeth herself was reportedly very pleased with the results. She appreciated the freshness he brought to these official images, and his work successfully captured a more human side of the royal family, without diminishing their dignity or status. This success elevated Anthony's standing considerably. The rakish and undeniably handsome young photographer suddenly found himself welcomed into royal circles. He was no longer just someone who occasionally took pictures of important people. He had become someone who was trusted by the monarchy itself, a position that few people from his background could have dreamed of achieving. His charm and talent had opened doors that his stepfamily's title alone could never have accessed. As his professional success grew and his proximity to the royal family increased, Anthony learned an important lesson about navigating high society. He became much more discreet about his romantic life. While he had never been particularly forthcoming about his personal relationships, he now understood that maintaining privacy was essential if he wanted to preserve his position. He remained polite and charming in social situations, qualities that endeared him to his clients and contacts, but he became notably tight-lipped whenever conversation turned to romance. The only relationship he allowed gossip writers to speculate about openly was his long and complicated involvement with a showgirl named Jacqueline Chan. Their on-and-off relationship provided plenty of material for society columns and seemed to satisfy the public's curiosity about his personal life. However, by the late 1950s, this very public romance with Jacqueline Chan was serving a different purpose entirely. Anthony was using the relationship as a convenient cover, a way to deflect attention from a far more significant and potentially scandalous connection he had formed. What had started as a friendship was gradually developing into something much deeper, and the identity of the woman involved would have shocked anyone who knew about it. She wasn't just another model or showgirl. She was Princess Margaret, the younger sister of Queen Elizabeth II, and their relationship was about to change both of their lives forever. The relationship between Anthony and Princess Margaret began innocently enough, at least on the surface. They had been seen together in public on several occasions, but always as part of larger groups where their interactions could be explained away as simple socializing. The princess, however, had started to take things further, in a way that revealed just how serious her feelings had become. She began disguising herself to visit Anthony's studio in secret, slipping away from her official duties and the ever-present scrutiny of the palace. During these private visits, Anthony would show her his ongoing projects and ask for her opinions on his work. These consultations gave them a legitimate excuse to spend time together, though it was clear to both of them that their connection had moved well beyond professional courtesy or casual friendship. The royal family found themselves in a delicate position. They were all too aware of what had happened with Princess Margaret's previous relationship to Peter Townsend, which had ended badly under intense media pressure and public debate. They were determined not to repeat those mistakes. But that didn't mean they were prepared to simply accept Anthony without conditions. If he was going to marry into the royal family, significant sacrifices would be required. The most substantial of these was that he would need to abandon his photography career entirely. For someone who had fought against his parents' disapproval to pursue this profession, and who had spent years building his reputation and success, this was no small demand. Nevertheless, Anthony agreed to their terms. He understood what was at stake and made his choice accordingly. Long before any announcement was made to the press or the public, Anthony began the quiet process of withdrawing from his professional commitments. He started turning down new assignments and carefully extracting himself from ongoing projects, all while maintaining the secrecy that the royal family insisted upon. When the official press release finally came in 1960, announcing the engagement of Princess Margaret and Anthony Armstrong Jones, it caught most people completely by surprise. The reaction was overwhelmingly positive, with one notable exception. Anthony's father responded in his characteristically cold manner, openly expressing doubts about whether his son was truly suited for this new role. He even compared Anthony's upcoming temporary residence in Buckingham Palace to being confined to military barracks, a comment that revealed his fundamental lack of enthusiasm for the match. The wedding took place on May 6, 1960, and it was a spectacular affair that made history in an unexpected way. For the first time ever, a royal wedding was broadcast on television, and an estimated 20 million people tuned in to watch the ceremony. It was a moment of national celebration and marked a new era in how the public could engage with royal events. After the wedding, Anthony and Margaret embarked on a 6-week honeymoon to the Caribbean, a lengthy trip that caused them to miss several events back home. Among these was the birth of a child to Jeremy Fry, one of Anthony's close friends. At the time, this seemed like an unremarkable absence, simply part of the natural consequence of being away for an extended honeymoon. Nobody could have predicted that this particular event would eventually come back to haunt Anthony in ways that would shock everyone involved. Despite the fairy tale appearance of their wedding and honeymoon, the reality of married life presented immediate challenges. More traditional segments of the British press had never fully approved of the union between a princess and someone they considered a commoner. Anthony found himself dealing with snobbery from multiple directions, and some of it came from surprisingly close quarters. Even within his own household, certain servants would treat him with barely concealed rudeness, viewing him as somehow less than the other royals because he hadn't been born into that world. Their disdain was based purely on the circumstances of his birth, something he could never change no matter how successful or talented he became. The situation within the broader royal family was equally uncomfortable at times. Prince Philip, who had always been somewhat cool toward Anthony, became openly hostile after the marriage. The two men were fundamentally different in almost every way that mattered. Anthony was artistic, sensitive, and moved in creative circles, while Philip embodied a more traditionally masculine ideal as a rugged outdoorsman who had served in the military. They simply didn't understand each other, and Philip made little effort to hide his distaste for his new brother-in-law. Combined with the negative press coverage and the fact that Anthony had given up the career that had defined him, the pressure on him was immense. It was only a matter of time before these mounting tensions would begin to crack the facade of marital happiness. In November 1961, Princess Margaret gave birth to their first child, a son. Shortly afterward, Anthony accepted the royal title of Earl of Snowdon, fully cementing his position within the aristocracy. on paper. Everything looked perfect. They had produced an heir, Anthony had a title, and they were positioned at the center of London's most exciting social scene. While Anthony and Margaret didn't share many interests or hobbies, they did have one significant thing in common. Both were caught up in the energy and excitement of swinging London in the early 1960s, and they each took full advantage of the opportunities this presented. Anthony managed to work his way into influential circles at Vogue magazine, surrounding himself with fashion industry heavyweights and creative talents. Margaret, meanwhile, formed friendships with major celebrities, including members of the Beatles and the actor Peter Sellers. They were both living glamorous lives, but increasingly they were living them separately. Their second child, a daughter named Sarah, was born in 1964. From the outside, they appeared to be the ideal family, with two beautiful children and enviable social connections. However, by 1965, the reality of their situation had become impossible for Anthony to bear. The distance between them had grown too wide, and the relentless pressure of royal life had worn him down. He desperately needed time away from the palace and from Margaret, so he arranged a trip with a friend from the publishing industry. The palace publicly explained that Margaret couldn't join them because she needed to remain at home while the Queen was absent. This official explanation was completely untrue. The real reason Anthony was traveling without his wife was that he had begun spending substantial amounts of time with Pamela Collin, a married editor at Vogue. The affair had progressed far beyond casual flirtation, and Anthony saw no reason to include Margaret in his plans. Princess Margaret was not the type of woman to simply accept her husband's infidelity without response. She decided that if Anthony could have affairs, then so could she. Her first extramarital relationship was with Anthony Barton, who happened to be her daughter's godfather, a choice that showed just how little concern she had for propriety at this point. She also began spending increasing amounts of time with Peter Sellers, the actor she had befriended earlier. Rumors circulated about possible dalliances with other famous men, including Mick Jagger, Warren Beatty, and Leslie Hutchinson. Then came her affair with Robin Douglas Home, who was the nephew of a former prime minister, and therefore someone whose involvement with the princess could not be easily dismissed or ignored. The relationship with Douglas Home was relatively brief, but its aftermath proved devastating. 18 months after their affair ended, Douglas Home took his own life at the age of 36. While it would be impossible to attribute his suicide solely to his involvement with Margaret, the timing suggested that the relationship and its ending had played some role in his despair. This tragedy marked just the beginning of what would become many more years of mutual infidelity and emotional damage between the royal couple. Their pattern of cheating and counter-cheating made everyone around them deeply uncomfortable. While Anthony seemed relatively unbothered by the arrangement, continuing his affairs with apparent ease, Margaret was clearly miserable. The rest of the royal family was acutely aware that the marriage had become a disaster. But they hoped that Anthony and Margaret could simply maintain separate lives quietly enough to avoid the embarrassment and scandal of a divorce. Divorce in the royal family was still considered unthinkable, something that would damage the monarchy's reputation and raise uncomfortable questions about the institution itself. The couple went along with this unofficial arrangement, but it weighed far more heavily on Margaret than on her husband. She began drinking more heavily and behaving rudely in public settings, her pain manifesting in ways that drew criticism from anti-monarchist groups who questioned why taxpayers should fund her lifestyle when she seemed to contribute so little and behave so poorly. It would take several more years and considerably more drama before the consequences of their failing marriage would finally catch up with them both. As the 1960s drew to a close, the constant cycle of affairs and recriminations had lost whatever excitement or satisfaction it might once have provided. It had simply become another exhausting aspect of their daily existence, a grim routine that neither seemed able or willing to break. During their honeymoon years earlier, a friend had given Anthony and Margaret a generous gift of a 6-acre plot of land on the small Caribbean island of Mostique. While Anthony had never bothered to return to the property after that initial trip, Margaret had found it to be a valuable refuge during the most difficult periods of her marriage. The island provided her with distance from the pressures of royal life and the constant tensions with Anthony. It was on this island that she began spending time with Roddy Llewellyn, a man who came from an interesting background as the son of a famous British equestrian, though he himself had never quite lived up to his family's expectations. Margaret and Roddy had known each other for a couple of years before their relationship became romantic. When they first met, he was 25 years old and she was 43, an age gap that would certainly raise eyebrows if it became public knowledge. At first, their relationship seemed like it would be just another affair in the long list of indiscretions that both Margaret and Anthony had accumulated over the years. However, this particular relationship would prove to be the one that finally brought everything crashing down. The media had largely turned a blind eye to the rumored affairs on both sides, maintaining a respectful distance from the private lives of the royal couple. That unspoken agreement was about to be shattered in dramatic fashion. Rupert Murdoch, the notorious press magnate, had decided that the public deserved to know what was really happening with Princess Margaret. He sent a journalist from New Zealand to Mustique with specific instructions. The reporter was to pose as an ordinary tourist vacationing with his wife, blending in with the other visitors to the island, while keeping his true purpose hidden. The plan worked perfectly. While pretending to enjoy a relaxing holiday, the journalist managed to capture photographs of Margaret and Roddy together, in circumstances that made the nature of their relationship unmistakably clear. When these photos were published, they created an immediate sensation. This was the final blow not just to the already fragile marriage between Anthony and Margaret, but also to the royal family's carefully maintained fiction that everything was fine behind closed doors. The publication of those photographs forced the royal family to confront what they had been trying to ignore for years. They could no longer pretend that the marriage was simply going through a rough patch, or that Anthony and Margaret were maintaining a civilized arrangement. The evidence was now public, and they finally had to acknowledge that the relationship was beyond saving. However, Anthony was no longer willing to wait for the royal family to decide when and how to proceed. He had his own life to live and his own plans to make. During this period, he had been spending increasing amounts of time working on documentary films, a new creative outlet that had become his primary professional focus after giving up photography. Through this work, he had grown close to a production assistant named Lucy Lindsay Hogg. Anthony had been making quiet attempts to secure a legal separation, but the royal family kept delaying and procrastinating, hoping perhaps that the situation would somehow resolve itself, or that public attention would move elsewhere. Frustrated with their endless stalling, Anthony decided to take matters into his own hands. Without consulting Margaret or seeking permission from the royal family, he publicly announced that he and Margaret were separating. This bold move caught everyone off guard and effectively forced the issue. The couple's divorce was finalized in 1978, officially ending a marriage that had been dead in all but name for many years. Anthony wasted absolutely no time in moving forward with his life. His relationship with Lucy Lindsay Hogg had evolved from a professional collaboration into something far more personal well before his divorce from Margaret was complete. Nevertheless, it still came as a shock to Margaret when Anthony announced, just 5 months after their divorce, that he would be marrying Lucy. The speed of this announcement suggested that he had been planning this next chapter for quite some time. They married in December 1978, and for a while it seemed like Anthony might finally have found some stability and happiness. However, the pattern of behavior that had defined his first marriage hadn't actually changed. While Anthony no longer carried the bitterness and resentment that had characterized the final decade with Princess Margaret, he also hadn't abandoned his tendency toward infidelity. Somewhere between his separation from Margaret and his divorce, he had begun yet another affair, this time with a married journalist named Anne Hills. When she read in the newspapers that Anthony had married Lucy, she was genuinely shocked. Despite this betrayal, she found herself unable to end things with him. She continued the affair, even though he was now married to someone else. This time, Anthony handled his infidelity differently than he had with Margaret. His marriage to Lucy appeared to be functioning well on the surface, so he saw no reason to flaunt his affair or use it as a weapon the way he had done during his first marriage. Instead, he kept his relationship with Anne Hills completely secret. The affair continued for an astonishing 20 years, a testament to both his ability to compartmentalize his life and Anne's willingness to accept whatever limited role he was prepared to give her. Throughout all those years, Anne wanted more from the relationship. She wanted Anthony to leave Lucy and commit to her fully. But with each passing year, it became increasingly clear that this would never happen. She tried to move on, seeing other people and even having boyfriends who lived with her. But she could never completely let go of Anthony or the hope that things might change. In late 1996, several things in Anne's life came crashing down simultaneously. She had been writing a column for the Guardian newspaper for many years, but she was unexpectedly let go from that position. Around the same time, another boyfriend had just ended their relationship and moved out. She spent yet another Christmas alone, without Anthony, who was presumably with Lucy and their family. The combination of these losses pushed Anne into a deep depression, from which she could not recover. She made the tragic decision to take her own life, leaving behind a note specifically addressed to Anthony. In it, she told him that she had always loved him and asked that a family heirloom he had given her be returned to him after her death. When authorities investigated her death, they discovered her diaries, which contained detailed accounts of her 20-year affair with Anthony. These personal writings documented everything about their relationship, including dates, conversations, and her feelings throughout those 2 decades. Before long, newspapers had obtained the contents of these diaries and were publishing excerpts across their pages. This was how Lucy, Anthony's wife, first learned that he had been systematically cheating on her throughout their entire marriage. The public humiliation was complete, and the private life he had worked so hard to keep hidden was now exposed for everyone to see. The revelation about Anne Hills was devastating enough, but Lucy would soon uncover yet another bombshell. Just 2 years after the scandal involving Anne's diaries had died down, Lucy discovered that Anthony had fathered a child with a magazine editor named Melanie Cable Alexander, who was nearly 30 years younger than him. This affair had apparently taken place more recently, showing that even in his later years, Anthony had maintained his pattern of seeking out younger women and engaging in relationships outside his marriage. Eventually, Anthony's relationship with Melanie ended, and Lucy finally filed for divorce. Once again, Anthony demonstrated his remarkable ability to move on quickly. Despite the circumstances of their divorce, Anthony and Lucy managed to maintain a friendship. Remarkably, Lucy even took care of him during his final years, when his health began to decline. It was during this period, as Anthony approached the end of his life, that many of his most shocking secrets finally emerged. The rumors about Anthony's sexuality had circulated for decades. Many people had speculated that he might be gay, given his close friendships with gay men and the persistent stories about possible male lovers. According to at least one biographer, Anthony eventually admitted to being bisexual later in his life. Several men came forward claiming to have had romantic relationships with him, though these claims have never been definitively proven or disproven. Whether or not these specific accounts were true, they added another layer to the complex picture of Anthony's private life. The public had watched Anthony and Margaret's marriage fall apart over many years, witnessing the affairs, the scandals, and eventually the divorce. Most people assumed they knew the full story. However, the reality was that the problems had started much earlier than anyone realized, and Anthony's betrayal ran far deeper than even the most cynical observers had imagined. While both Anthony and Margaret had hurt each other badly during their marriage, it became clear that Anthony had instigated the entire destructive pattern from the very beginning. In 2004, DNA testing finally revealed a secret that Anthony had kept hidden for over 4 decades. The test proved that he had fathered an illegitimate daughter, who was born just weeks into his marriage to Princess Margaret. A British woman named Polly Fry learned that Anthony was her biological father, and the timing was particularly shocking. She had been born during Anthony and Margaret's honeymoon, that 6-week trip to the Caribbean that was supposed to mark the beginning of their happy life together. While Margaret was enjoying what she thought was the start of her marriage, somewhere back in England, another woman was giving birth to her husband's child. Polly had grown up believing that her father was Jeremy Fry, a member of the wealthy family behind Fry's Chocolate. Jeremy had been one of Anthony's closest friends and had nearly served as best man at his wedding to Princess Margaret. This revelation meant that Anthony had not only cheated on Margaret, but he had done so with his best friend's wife, Camilla Fry. The betrayal was multi-layered, involving not just his new bride, but also one of the people he was supposedly closest to. Both Jeremy Fry and Anthony initially denied the story when questions first arose, maintaining their lies for years. It was only after Jeremy's death that Anthony finally admitted the truth. The DNA test removed any remaining doubt, confirming what many had suspected and what Anthony had finally confessed. This final revelation cemented Anthony Armstrong Jones's legacy, not as a talented photographer or even as Princess Margaret's troubled husband, but as someone whose personal life was characterized by deception, betrayal, and a seemingly endless capacity for hurting the people closest to him.